thank you very much, Dean Kay, for that generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a Friday night of Halloween weekend to hear me speak. And many thanks also to the organizers of the Nelson Speaker Series for giving me this opportunity to address you all tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with all of you the policies that are a California policy and regulatory perspective on creating a sustainable energy sector. Very briefly, what I'll do in my talk is start by giving you a policy context, starting pretty broadly and then zooming in on the solar industry. And then I'll talk about our programs in the area of solar energy in California, starting with distributed small-scale photovoltaic solar rooftop PV, and then talking about a separate but equally important area of solar policy, large-scale central station solar development, both of which, and both of these are really important components of our policies in this area. And then I'll close just by touching on a few key points relating to future challenges and opportunities in the solar space. And then I think we'll have some time for Q&A after that. So California has been pursuing policies to promote energy efficiency and clean energy since the 70s, so for several decades now. You might recognize that young man over there who used to have more hair is our governor, who at the time that he first served as governor was known as Governor Moonbeam, in part because of his vigorous advocacy for clean energy and energy efficiency policies. Back then, one of our main motivations, or our principal motivation for pursuing energy efficiency and clean energy was really to wean ourselves from dependence on foreign oil, a concern that continues to resonate to this day. Avoiding further investments in nuclear power also was an issue that was particularly salient in California back in the 70s. Well, California's leadership in this area in energy and now climate policy has continued with some fits and starts to this day, and has been particularly strong in the last decade under Governor Schwarzenegger. And although Governor Schwarzenegger was the one who's famous for saying, "I'll be back," interestingly, it's maybe Jerry Brown who'll be back as soon as next week to resume his leadership in clean energy policy. So, and I, for one, look forward to serving in yet another administration where clean energy and energy efficiency will be front and center in the priorities, in the state's priorities. So, I can't talk about clean energy without first saying a little bit about energy efficiency, because we have a really tremendous track record in California that we can all be proud of. And at the same time, we still have a long way to go. So what this chart contrasts, the dotted lines on here trace out the U.S. in red and California per capita gross domestic product over the last 30 years. And you can see that they've more or less gone up together. California has actually leapt out in front of the nation as a whole over the last decade. The other pair of lines, again, red for the U.S., blue for California, trace out the per capita electricity use for the state and for the country as a whole. And what you can see that it's per capita energy usage has stayed flat in California over the last 3 decades, while it's gone up by about 50% at the national level. And this is really a tremendous accomplishment in California. What this means is that if the rest of the country had matched the record that we've achieved in California through aggressive investment in energy efficiency, as a nation, we could have avoided building 500 megawatts, so full size, 500 big power plants nationwide over this 30-year period if the rest of the country had matched what California has done on energy efficiency. And I should note that most of those power plants that were built that might not have needed to be built, these are coal-fired power plants, the ones that contribute the most both to global warming and to respiratory and cardiac illness, other forms of illness caused by air pollution. So this is really a significant accomplishment that we've made in our state and a tremendous example we've set for the rest of the country. Now, in California today, we increasingly see energy policy as climate policy, that really energy policy and climate policy are two sides of the same coin. And throughout this decade, California's elected leaders have adopted several policies that have been aimed at improving efficiency of homes, appliances, and vehicles, reducing emissions from power generation by mandating increased use of renewable resources, and lowering the carbon content of transportation fuels. And this is just a list of some of the highlights of the policies that we've adopted in California over this period. These are certainly by no means the only ones. And in this picture, you see Governor Schwarzenegger signing what is probably the single most important one of all of these measures, known in shorthand as AB 32, or formally as the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006. And what AB 32 does is call for California, or sets a hard target for California to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020, and to cut back to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And that cutback, that 2050 goal, is in line with most studies that have been done on the types of reductions that will need to be, or the magnitude of reductions that will need to be undertaken by developed economies in order to prevent dangerous interference with the climate from occurring. So in a sense, with AB 32, California is really kind of adopting the policies that scientists tell us that across the board need to be implemented in developed countries. I should note that as someone who is a very strong supporter of AB 32 and has put a lot of my career into making sure that we meet these targets of AB 32, I have viewed the presence on the ballot this year of Proposition 23 with some alarm. It appears to be the case that Proposition 23, which would in effect indefinitely suspend AB 32, it appears that Prop 23 is likely to lose. It's not within my responsibilities, or indeed I'm not permitted to go out and encourage you to vote one way or the other, but I was not allowed to do that as an appointed official. But I do want to note the connection between Prop 23 and AB 32. It's not a coincidence that Prop 23 is kind of the reverse of AB 32. Okay, so in any event, let me talk a little bit more, give a little bit of background about California's greenhouse gas emissions, and then talk a little bit more about AB 32 and how our renewable energy programs fit into AB 32. So what this pie chart shows is the breakdown of the inventory of California's greenhouse gas emissions, shows you where our greenhouse gas emissions come from. And these two wedges that stand out are for the electricity sector in California. So all told, electricity counts for about a quarter of California's greenhouse gas emissions. I'll say something else about that in a minute, because you'll note that wedge is split in two. But let me note something else. That in most of the, if you look at the statistics for the U.S. as a whole, the electric sector is about 50%. The reason that we are only at 25% is twofold. The first, because we have very relatively clean generation mix in California, and compared to the nation, much less coal in our generation mix. And then this is California, and we like to drive. So transportation is a much bigger wedge in California than it is in other places. So we don't really look too much like the rest of the country. The other thing that's interesting here is that the greenhouse gas emissions for the electric sector are pretty much equally split between the power that we import and the power that we generate in state. The reason that that's interesting is because imported energy actually only accounts for about 20% of our electricity supply in California, 20 to 25%, depending on what kind of hydro conditions we have. But we don't have any coal-fired power plants in California. The coal all comes by wire. So this import wedge is the coal. And the power plants are in Utah, Arizona, and I think some parts of the Northwest, but mainly Utah and Arizona, is where we get our coal-fired power from. And that, so it's half the imports, or pardon me, half the greenhouse gas emissions for the sector, but only about 20% of the power. And it's actually more noteworthy because the rest of the imports are almost all hydro. So that's really the coal piece. Okay. Okay, so more pie charts. I mentioned before, I started talking about AB 32 before, which requires the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. AB 32 put another agency, the California Air Resources Board, in the driver's seat, put them in charge of developing and implementing a plan to meet that greenhouse gas reduction target. That plan is called the Scoping Plan. These charts are based on an earlier draft of it, but are consistent with what's in the final Scoping Plan. So the Scoping Plan is the statewide, sector-by-sector blueprint for how we will achieve the mandated emissions reductions. And the total amount of emission reductions that was used in the scoping, or that was the basis for the Scoping Plan, was 174 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent would be the reductions that were required. And the reductions, if you take the Scoping Plan in its totality and look where those reductions are projected to come from, a goodly chunk, that looks to me about a third, is from the transportation sector. About a little bit more than a third, about 40% is from the energy sector, electricity and gas. Another 20% or so is from other mandates in other industries. And then 20% is kind of left to be achieved through a cap and trade system. And so then breaking down this wedge or this 40% that is going to come from is projected to come from the electricity and gas sectors. So that's about 50 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. About half of that will come from energy efficiency, and all the rest of it will come from clean energy mandates, from raising our renewable portfolio standard from the current target of 20% by 2020, but really 2013, to 33% by 2020. So a hefty increase in the amount of energy we get from renewable sources. And then the California Solar Initiative, which I'll talk more about. So those two measures together, the lighter green, are renewable energy policies. Let's just, okay. Oh, and I'll just mention that the previous couple of slides back, I listed some of the kind of marquee policies that comprise the state's suite of greenhouse gas reduction policies. And two really important ones that account for most of the reductions in the transportation sector are the so-called PAVLI tailpipe standards for vehicles. So Senator Fran Pavley, now Senator from Fran Pavley, formerly an Assembly member from down here in Southern California, was the author of this bill back in 2002, which required the Air Resources Board to set tailpipe standards for greenhouse gas emissions for passenger vehicles. It was the first in the nation standard of its kind and has now been adopted by the Obama administration at the federal level. So that basically makes vehicles more fuel efficient and therefore emit less greenhouse gases. The other component is the low carbon fuel standard, which aims to, it requires a 10% reduction in the carbon intensity of California's transportation fuels by 2020. And so effectively is intended to drive other types of fuels, and whether they be biofuels, hydrogen, electricity, or whatnot, drive other types of fuels into the mix for powering personal transportation in California. Okay, so policies in California that focus on greenhouse gas emissions need to be seen as part of our broader effort to shift the energy mix over time to a less carbon-intensive set of resources and to a more efficient basis. So back in 2005, California energy policymakers got together and developed something called the Energy Action Plan, which was a kind of consolidated roadmap for energy policy in California. And a foundational part of that Energy Action Plan was something that we now refer to as the loading order, which is essentially sets the priorities for investments in resources, supply and demand side resources for the electric sector going forward. So this is really, the loading order is really the organizing principle for energy policy in California today. And essentially what the loading order does is to say our resource of our first choice resource is energy efficiency and demand response. By demand response, I simply mean measures to reduce demand at peak periods, but especially energy efficiency. Reducing the need to use electricity and reducing the amount of capacity that we have to have in order to serve the peak. So that is the resource that is the top of the loading order. Nevertheless, we expect that energy demand will grow some over time, and that older plants will need to be replaced. And so the second step in the loading order is to maximize the role of clean or renewable energy in the resource mix. So that's the second step of the loading order. And then finally, to the extent that we rely on fossil-fired power, it should be as clean and as efficient as possible. So this is really the, again, the sort of the organizing principle for how we think about procurement of resources to meet customers' energy needs in California. Okay, so let me zero in now on the renewable component. Probably the single biggest renewable energy policy that we have in California is the California Renewable Portfolio Standard. The law on the books today requires that we get 20% of our energy from renewable resources by 2010, although with flexible compliance rules, in effect, the utility companies have until 2013 to meet that target, though they owe us for what they were supposed to do in the intervening year. So we're in the midst of essentially closing the deal on the 20% target. For the last 3 years, the legislature has struggled mightily and as yet failed to produce a bill that everybody agrees that we need, which will raise the RPS to 33% by 2020. And because the Public Utilities Commission has stated that this is what we regard as the, in the long term will be the policy of California, Governor Schwarzenegger has made it very clear that he supports a 33% RPS. Both candidates in the gubernatorial race have stated their support for a 33% RPS, and so although we do not yet have a 33% law on the 33% RPS law on the books, yet we are kind of collectively as regulators and within the industry really moving forward towards achieving that 33% target. And in fact, Governor Schwarzenegger did order the Air Resources Board under its AB 32 authority to adopt rules to accomplish a 33% RPS, and they have done that. So there is a vehicle to move forward with the 33% RPS while the legislature and all the various stakeholders hammer out a bill that everyone can agree on. So that's probably, again, the single most important policy that we have, and I'll come back and talk some more about that as well. Another policy that we have that gets a lot of headlines is the California Solar Initiative, sometimes called the Million Solar Roofs program. And the CSI has subsidies to home and business owners who install solar PV equipment on their rooftops typically. And the aim is to get up to 3,000 megawatts, so that's like 10 good-sized power plants worth of solar statewide on rooftops. In addition, we have what's called a feed-in tariff, where if you generate solar energy by solar, you can sell it at a fixed rate back to the utility. We have a feed-in tariff program for 750 megawatts of renewables for somewhat bigger projects than are accommodated by the California Solar Initiative. Over the last year or so, each of the 3 big investor-owned utilities in California, Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric, have all come to the Public Utilities Commission and received approval to have their own programs to develop photovoltaic installations within their service territories. Typically, part of the program will be achieved by the utility building and owning PV installations, for example, on vacant land around their substations or in other settings where they have some sort of unique competence to be able to develop it. And then typically the other half of the program involves a competitive solicitation where developers can come in and propose projects that will be PV-based projects that typically are kind of within load centers, within populated areas. And then finally we have coming up for consideration by the Commission a policy that I'm particularly interested in that we call the RAM, or the Renewable Auction Mechanism. And here the idea is that the utilities go out and they do a competitive solicitation for developers who will propose to build any kind of renewable energy project. Does not have to be solar, does not have to be just PV, but they have a competitive solicitation process for renewable energy. It's a standardized, kind of a standardized contract, standardized bid. So the idea, this is for kind of the littler projects that are for whom it's too complicated to put a bid together in the RPS program. Littler projects can do a standardized bidding process where it's easier to make a comparison. If you don't deliver within 18 months, you're out. There's no renegotiation, as often happens with the bigger projects in the RPS. So if you look across this whole array of policies, and this is not the menu, the basic theme here is to really try to tailor as many different policies as we can to different types of players that might be willing and able to develop renewable resources, and particularly solar resources in California. So there's a lot of different opportunities for players of different sizes, of different competencies, focusing on different kinds of resources to participate in this space. I think that's, again, probably the single most important thing about this. Okay, so let's zoom in further and talk about the solar policies in particular. So I'll start by talking about the small-scale projects, what we call distributed generation, because it's distributed, sprinkled throughout the grid, and that's mostly photovoltaic, solar photovoltaic, or PV. So I'll take some time to talk about those policies and how we're doing in that domain, and then I'll turn to the other major area where we're seeing significant amounts of investment in the solar domain, and that's the large-scale or central station solar generation. So I'll take some time to talk about that as well. So this map gives you a sense of just how tremendous a resource we have here in California for solar development. The redder it is, the better the solar insolation properties, and the better the resources. And you can see that California and Arizona are really the best places in terms of solar insolation in the whole U.S. And I was looking at this map with a colleague, and I said, so I guess I could say that California is the Saudi Arabia of solar power. My colleague said, well, no, when you think about it, I think actually Saudi Arabia is the Saudi Arabia of solar power. So I had to concede that point. But nevertheless, within the U.S., we're the Saudi Arabia of solar power. So with qualifications, I still think we're looking pretty good. Okay, so I already said a little bit about the California Solar Initiative, and I want to drill down a little bit more on that right now. So this is the second largest solar initiative program in the world. Again, as I noted before, the goal of this program is to get 3,000 megawatts of solar photovoltaics installed in California by 2017. This program targets both existing structures, installation of solar on existing structures, and incorporation of PV into new homes and new offices. So there's segments of the program for each. This is a statewide program. It encompasses the investor-owned utilities that my agency regulates, and it also encompasses the municipal or publicly owned utilities like Glendale, Burbank, LADWP, down here, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, up in my neck of the woods. The rebates in this program are based on, to the extent possible, are based on the performance of solar systems. So in other words, you don't just get money for tacking solar panels on your roof. You get money for making solar energy with solar panels that you put on your roof. So it's really an incentive-based system to the extent that it can be. The overarching goal here with this program is to create a sustainable solar industry through an orderly tenure approach that will provide a stable environment to generate investment and stimulate learning by doing, stimulate technological innovation in California. We want to avoid the kind of boom-bust cycles that have occurred in other places, most notably Spain is a good example of that, and strive for steady, sustainable growth that builds the whole, kind of ecosystem around the solar industry in California. So I'm not going to explain this slide in great detail, but this I like this chart because it really gives you a sense of what I think are some of the really nice design features of the California Solar Initiative program. So we've got two different axes, well actually three different axes here. It's a very complicated graph, but the key point here is that here the staircase, we're measuring the cumulative amount of installation of solar PV installed through the program over time. And you notice this is not, however, this is not a time scale along here. It's just steps. So there's, we don't, and then these are the incentive payments. And what you see is that the incentive payments for different sectors, this is commercial and residential, and this is government and nonprofit, the payments gradually go down over time as the cumulative amount of solar goes up over time. And the key point here is that the payments don't go down based on the amount of time elapsed. The payments go down based on the amount of PV that's actually been installed under the program. So it's kind of a self-regulating process. If we get to a point where we kind of stall out and we're not seeing the installations happen at a given price level, then we basically pause and wait at that price level until the industry catches up, and then we move forward. There would be no point in stepping further down if we weren't getting the installations done at the proceeding level. And so what you see here is for the three different investor-owned utilities, Pacific Gas and Electric, SDG&E, and some of SCE, and then Edison, where they are on these stair steps. So PG&E has been a standout in a good way on CSI, and they've gotten the furthest. And I think that goes both to the kind of nuts and granola, kind of Northern California, doing solar kind of way of life. Has a lot to do with PG&E's rate structure, where it's actually more attractive to put solar in PG&E, given the way that their rates are structured. And then we have SDG&E, not too far behind, and your local utility still struggling to catch up. So, but all of them have moved along a fair amount. And statewide, we're about halfway through the program on the clock, and statewide we have reached about, we're at about 50% of the goal. So we're making good progress statewide. PG&E is already up to 58% of its goal. San Diego Gas and Electric's at 54%, and Edison is at 41%. So everyone's making progress, some more than others. So we are really climbing the staircase, and I think that we will see this program be a big success. And I will note that despite the recession, this program remains very popular. The last, the first 6 months of this year, we had, let's see, maybe do I have it on here? Actually, let's go ahead to the next slide. In the first 6 months of this year, there were 10,000 applications under the CSI program for a total of 300 megawatts. So that's 10% of the whole program in just 6 months of this year. That's the largest number of applications for any 6-month program since for any 6-month period since the program started. So the recession has really not put a damper on the CSI, and interestingly, interest remains very strong in the new homes part of the program as well. Although obviously housing starts are much slower than they were at the time that this program was created. So while the interest is strong, we're not really seeing the results on the ground yet. But the important thing is that when the housing market picks up again, the developers are really interested in incorporating solar into new homes. So I think those are the main points there. Then one other thing that I want to note about the Solar Initiative program, this is something that was baked into the cake right from the start, is that in addition to having incentives that are aimed at really building that sustainable industry and creating the demand for solar power, it also has an important research development, demonstration, and deployment programs. There's actually a missing D up there. And the goal here is to basically help move this industry on to the next level by identifying through competitive bidding processes or competitive solicitations really promising projects either in the private sector or at research institutions that can really help address some of the challenging issues with, for example, grid integration of PV or production technologies, ways of making panels or building modules. or the actual business development and deployment model. So the various different aspects of the solar industry. The Commission is now approving grants that are going out again to research institutions and companies that are doing research projects in these areas to help move the industry along. And we've already had 2 rounds of grants under the CSI RDD&D program. And among the grantees are UC San Diego, Clean Power Research, SunPower, which is a major solar PV company, SMUD, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, Solar City, another company, UC Davis. Big focus in these grants initially has been on integration of PV into the grid, and also on a really important complementary technology, energy storage. So I hope that one day there'll be a grant to Harvey Mudd from one of these research projects. And some of the students that I heard at lunchtime today seem like they're quite capable of doing some good work that might merit one of these grants. Okay, so let me turn now and talk about the big stuff, the heavy metal of the solar world. So this is, these are examples of the different types of technologies that, in this case, the trough, are now deployed in California. This is probably the SEGS facility, which is down in the desert. I've been there, but I really didn't know where I was. But it's down here somewhere. These are the sun catcher discs with Stirling engines on top that are made by, what's that company's name? They keep changing their names. Tessera, I think, is their name now. Earlier known as Stirling, I think. This is a power tower, and we have one here in California near Lancaster, and a big new one is, I think, just had its groundbreaking the other day, and then this is a PV array. So when we talk about large-scale solar generation, it could be solar thermal, where we use troughs or towers to heat oil and drive turbines, or it could be huge arrays of PV. We're seeing both types of projects bid in. So this is just an area of explosive growth in California. And to give you a sense of that, these are some charts that are based on the procurement that the utilities are doing in the Renewable Portfolio Standard program. So that's, most of this is in that RPS program. 20% currently, headed to 33% in the not-too-distant future. So what you see here in terms of what the utilities project to be, or our staff projects based on the data we get from the utilities, what we project to see in terms of delivered renewable energy in California. The amount of delivered energy is going up. You see these bars rising from in 5-year increments from 2005 to 2020, so going up by a factor of a little more than, or about 3. But the most important thing to note in here is that this, the kind of yellowish or beige part of the bar is the part that's going to come from solar, and this is where, by far the biggest growth is projected is in the part that comes from solar. Wind is the other area that historically has already been a major contributor and will grow quite a bit more, but won't have the order of magnitude in growth that we anticipate from solar. And it's those big projects that, examples of which I showed you on the previous slide. These are big installations, 200, 500, 800 megawatts that are going to account for those big beige or yellow chunks there. So this is another way of looking at similar data. Instead of looking at the projections for the delivered energy, this shows you what we're actually seeing in the competitive solicitations that the utilities do for energy to comply with the Renewable Portfolio Standard. When they do a solicitation each year, what's the breakdown in the solicitation between different technologies? And so if you go back a few years, it was mostly wind and geothermal. But in the last 2 years, the solar component has just exploded. And note 2 things, actually. First, that these recent solicitations have just been huge. The number of bids, the number of megawatts that have bid in have been huge. And solar is increasingly dominating these solicitations. So it really is the future for renewable energy in California. It's looking increasingly like it will be solar energy. Now, unfortunately, Not everyone loves solar. Solar is good for communities, the kind of remote desert communities or places in the Imperial Valley where there's not a lot else going on economically, where you can sometimes have huge, very high unemployment rates. So it can be very good for people, particularly during the construction period, where you will have a real jolt of stimulus to the economy. And then you have, in most cases, several dozen jobs at least, good jobs continuing. But there are critters, many of whom, some of which are endangered or threatened, that live in the same places that solar energy where the solar energy resources are the best. And these are some of the ones that are of the greatest concern. So starting up here, that's the San Joaquin kit fox, the desert tortoise. Let's see, what is this one? This is the Mojave ground squirrel, the peninsular bighorn sheep, and the kangaroo rat. So somehow we have to figure out how to get solar energy out of the desert while living in harmony with the various critters that were there first. And this has been a big challenge so far. Siting, so I've talked so far mainly about the business side of solar, the regulations or the policies and the incentive programs that create the demand for renewable energy, and in particular solar, the kind of response that we've seen out of the industry in terms of the types of plants that they propose to build, and how the economics are driving the mix. But one important thing, or two really important things, they have to get over two really important hurdles before we ever see a kilowatt of energy. The first thing is that the power plant itself has to get a permit to operate, has to get an environmental permit. If it's a thermal facility, a solar thermal facility, then they need to get a permit from the California Energy Commission. If it's a photovoltaic facility, then they need to get a permit from the local siting authority, which is typically a county. Many of these plants are totally or partially on public land, federal land typically, and so then you have a federal agency involved. You have an environmental impact statement under the California law. You have an California's environmental impact review under CEQA. Federal part is environmental impact statement under NEPA. A long and complicated process that involves taking account of impact on critters like these as well as other factors. Also, building new solar plants in the desert far away from where people live means that you also have to build transmission lines to get the power from the desert to the cities where the people are. And building transmission lines and permitting transmission lines is even more challenging and more contentious than permitting power plants. And my agency does transmission siting. The California Energy Commission, as I mentioned before, and local authorities are the ones that do the power plant siting. And this has been a topic of really tremendous amount of energy and effort has gone into trying to work with all of the stakeholders involved. So environmental advocates, wildlife advocates, local residents, tribes. Tribes are very important, particularly in Southern California. The federal authorities, the state authorities, to really kind of work through the challenging siting issues so that we can get the power plants permitted with the least possible impact and get the transmission built to get them to the cities. And I will note, just to give you a sense of the kind of the magnitude of the challenge here, once upon a time, I mean, the California Energy Commission was really, in some ways, created to permit power plants. And a typical 500 megawatt combined cycle gas turbine plant takes up about 30 to 80 acres of land. A solar thermal plant takes 6 to 8 acres per megawatt. So that's 5 to 8 square miles for a 500 megawatt plant. Okay, so that's 150 times as much space as it takes to build a gas-fired power plant. You can put a lot of critters in 5 to 8 square miles. And so the challenge, the siting challenge for the siting agencies on the power plant side is really immense. And I will say that I think that we've really seen some significant progress in that area. We've really seen a heroic effort at the Energy Commission with a big assist from Governor Schwarzenegger. The federal government has been very helpful in coordinating efforts of the federal agencies with our state agencies. And over the course of this year, mostly over the course of the last few months, the Energy Commission alone has permitted 7 solar thermal plants for a total of 3,543 megawatts. So that's a lot. And the rush, part of the push why we've been able to do so much so fast is because there has been federal stimulus money available to help buy down the cost of these plants. And so basically the governor said, essentially said, like, we're going to get that money for our state and for our industry, and we're going to figure out what it takes to get these plants permitted in an environmentally responsible way in order to get the money, and we're succeeding in that. Okay, so let me talk about one other interesting challenge in this in the solar arena, and that is, as we build more and more renewable energy in California, it will be more and more challenging to integrate these resources into the grid. The grid is made to transmit power from faraway power plants one way to people in cities. But now we're putting distributed generation all throughout the grid. So we have locations on the grid that sometimes during the day are using energy. They're sucking power off the grid. But if they've got PV or some other kind of generation on site, other times of the day they're putting energy into the grid. And it's one thing to do it, a little bit here and there, the way that we did it for, the last few decades. But at the size and scale that we're doing this today, we really have to. It's a much bigger challenge, and we have to move forward in a more deliberate way. Similarly, both solar and wind, and I'll explain what's on this chart in a sec, but both of them have sort of distinct profiles and intermittent characteristics that also present challenges. So the blue line here is the profile of production from a wind farm. And what you see is that it runs at night, and then in the morning it's sort of becalmed. It doesn't make very much energy, although it jiggles up and down a little bit. And then in the evening it comes back up again. Okay, so I could show you another chart for wind, and I've seen some that basically just go like this. So it's off and on, it's off and on, it's off and on. But the main one in this is just that it's making the most energy when it's the least valuable because it's working at night. Solar, on the other hand, obviously you only make solar energy during the daytime. This audience in particular, I bet I don't have to explain that to. But it makes more at noon than it does earlier in the day or later in the day or earlier in the day. And clouds go by, and the production goes up and it goes down. And again, if you just have sort of a few rooftops here and there scattered through the service territory, well, that just sort of gets lost in the noise. But when you really scale up, as we're going to be doing over the course of this decade, then it matters. And it can, I heard anecdotally the other day that down in San Diego, they've actually had sort of challenges with regulating the voltage on their system because of basically clouds passing through over solar facilities. So also, you don't have to have a engineering degree to notice the fact that there's this reverse correlation between the solar energy production and the wind energy production. So in some ways, they're very complementary. And being able to put those two pieces together and plan a system around having resources like this in the system and balancing them out is part of what I call the integration challenge. So some of it is information, distributed sensors and controls, and the ability to react and regulate. Some of it is the technology. Some of it is integrating storage into systems so that you smooth out those peaks from solar generation. So there are a lot of different dimensions to the solution. And Dean Cave, in his introduction of me, noted that I'm the assigned commissioner at the PUC for Smart Grid. Smart Grid stands for a lot of things. Fundamentally, it's putting sensors and communications and IT capability throughout the grid, into the grid and throughout the grid. And one component of that is how we manage this kind of intermittency on the generation side. Another part of it is how we interact with customers and use the ability of customers to regulate their loads or even have their usage automatically controlled, so that we have kind of another resource that can balance out these swings. So today we have what we call demand response programs, where big industrial facilities may actually shut down a production line during the peak hours on a hot day in exchange for a big payment from the utility. To me, that's 20th century. That's so 20th century. Like 21st century demand response is where you have automated controls in all kinds of homes and buildings that can talk to the central dispatch system, and where little, barely perceptible, maybe imperceptible adjustments in lighting levels or heating and cooling levels that are aggregated across, tens of thousands of buildings compensate in real time for these kinds of swings. That's where we're headed in the future. And these are the kinds of things that we'll need to do in order to be able to accommodate ever greater levels of renewable energy into our grid. So let me wrap up just by talking about sort of one reason why, or sort of a final reason to be excited about this transition, and to be, and particularly to be here in California. Our state is the epicenter of the clean energy revolution in the United States. This is the place where it's happening. Our state leads the U.S. in green tech patents in several areas: solar technology, wind, battery technology. Our share of patents, we're active in several areas. We also account for, we get the lion's share of venture capital in the clean energy domain. Clean tech investment in California was over $2 billion last year. We get more than our fair share of those funds on a demographic basis. And these funds, this money is flowing into companies that work on energy generation technologies. And so I think the future is very bright in California, and schools like Harvey Mudd are producing the people who are going to be powering that future, providing the intellectual firepower to perpetuate this revolution and keep California at the forefront in terms of both policy and technology. So with that, I want to thank you again for coming out to listen to me tonight, and for all the work that people here are doing in the engineering and chemistry and material science. And I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
I'll let you pick them.
Okay, sure. Okay.
We definitely have time for questions. I will just ask you to await. Put your hand up. Commissioner Ryan will pick you out. Wait for the mic so that everyone can hear your question.
Can you tell us about the role of PPAs, power purchase agreements, in terms of providing opportunities for smaller organizations, independent power providers, to go after various markets through the customer through these PPAs?
Sure. So one thing I try to give a sense of in my talk is that we have a variety of different programs through which the utilities are purchasing energy from independent energy producers. So some of it is utility-owned generation. Most of it in the renewable space is being developed by independent power producers, so non-utility companies. You can get a PPA by a power purchase agreement by bidding into one of the utilities' solicitations under the Renewable Portfolio Standard Program. Those are usually pretty big projects. I mean, they can be 1,000 megawatts. I've seen contracts, the Commission approves all the PPAs. They can be as little as 7 megawatts. But they're fairly good-sized projects. If that's not your cup of tea, if you're going to do projects on a smaller scale, then this renewable auction mechanism that I talked about is a way to bid in a more standardized way, and then you don't negotiate a power purchase agreement with all kinds of terms and conditions that are specific to your project. There's a standard power purchase agreement that you enter into with the utility that makes it, basically lowers the transactions costs for all involved. The utilities then have their own separate programs where they're also doing solicitations that are aimed at smaller projects, 1 to 3 megawatts. And then in the less than a megawatt case, that's pretty much handled by the California Solar Initiative. So there's really different ways that you could end up with a power purchase agreement depending on the scale that you operate at and the level of complexity that your project has.
And just a quick follow-up. So does the PPA only allow you to sell to the utilities? What if a small, let's say you build a wind farm or solar farm and you want to, directly market to and sell to, customers at large. Obviously, you can't reach them directly through, the transmission facilities. You have to have the utilities as the middleman. Is there a way for small solar farm operators, like 10 megawatt, 20 megawatt, to go directly to the customers and say, sign them up as customers and then,
it's a complicated landscape in California. The sort of wreckage of the restructured energy markets that were established were established in the 90s and fell apart in the early part of this decade has left a very complicated landscape. So as a practical matter, if you were a small energy producer and you were not selling to a utility, I suppose that you could sell to a marketer who would turn around and take responsibility for remarketing the power. Selling direct to a customer is a little bit more challenging because you have to have some means of delivering it to the customer, and then that makes you some sort of a wholesaler. So it would take a long time and a lot of lawyers to answer your question properly. But the short answer is there's things to do, but you can't just kind of go into business selling energy to end users easily. There's somebody in the back row, if you want to pass the mic up.
Yeah, I was looking at the pie charts in the beginning, so it seems like a fairly progressive trend has been happening that you've been supporting, and but the question with the pie charts that I had is, for instance, like I used to work down at Black Mesa, Arizona. There's that coal plant that takes a slurry line, because you were mentioning water too. It takes water in a slurry line up there, and a lot of the power from California comes from Mojave Generating Station. So in that chart, basically I was saying, like, how much power does your agency, being like state, or is it, or are you in federal, or are you your state agency?
Public Utilities Commission is a California agency.
Right, so,
I think you're referring to the pie chart that showed
where
over
half, like 13% of the incoming, like over half of the incoming, from like coal power was coming from the outside. So basically, what I'm asking is that since you're representative of a state agency, like how much influence do you have over regulating that, because that's going towards greenhouse gases and all that, because you know what Black Mesa, Arizona is, right?
Oh yeah, no, I'm gonna.
And the Navajo Reservation, and then that's a federal land. I mean, well, it's native land, but it's federally regulated. So I was just seeing, like, if your agency has like any power or no power over regulating or influence or regulating something right next door, but all the power is coming into California from it.
My agency actually has a lot of influence, and let me explain. So I talked about so the chart that he's referring to is the pie chart that showed the breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions, California's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, that showed that a quarter of the emissions, of the greenhouse gas emissions, come from the electric sector, and half of the in-state and half are from out-of-state resources. Because we import typically 20 to 25% of our energy. So how do we influence those resources that are located out of state from which we buy energy? And the example he gave was the Mojave Power Plant in Laughlin, Nevada, which uses coal mined on the Hopi Reservation from Black Mountain and transmitted as a slurry in a pipeline to the Mojave plant, which was or is owned, at least in part, by Southern California Edison. So we have a tremendous amount of influence, because the commission over the Public Utilities Commission, not only do we get to set the rates that the electric utilities charge, but we also are responsible for approving the portfolios of resources that they will use to meet their customers' energy needs. And when I talked about the loading order, that's really the framework that we use to think about those portfolios. So the Commission adopted a policy pursuant to state law a few years back that, in effect, was intended to prevent new long-term investments in coal-fired generation, whether it's in-state or out-of-state. The important thing that we regulate is what they buy. Where they get it from doesn't matter. But what the emissions performance standard said in a nutshell is no more conventional coal. You cannot get approval to recover costs of buying electricity that's generated using conventional coal-fired generation. So since that's all outside of California, that in effect put the damper on importing any new coal-fired power into California. And the Mojave plant that you referenced actually closed down in 2006 because for other reasons related to conventional air quality problems from that plant. But I think in anticipation of also being that it would require significant upgrades to the plant to keep it running, which would run afoul of this emissions performance standard. That's an example actually of how California, policies reach outside of California and prevent new investments in coal-fired power for our purposes. We can't obviously influence what Wyoming buys and runs for Wyoming, but we can influence what our utilities buy and cause to be run on behalf of California customers. Sir?
I wonder if you have any thoughts about the effectiveness of cap and trade for carbon dioxide emissions. I can see it worked well for sulfur oxide emissions,
Right.
but carbon dioxide worldwide is a much different thing.
Mm-hmm.
With the cap and trade program, do you have thoughts about what sort of sources you would be allowed to trade?
I mean, as an economist, I'm a big fan of cap and trade, at least in principle. And I absolutely believe that cap and trade has to be a foundational element of any comprehensive program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I don't think that cap and trade alone is sufficient to control greenhouse gas emissions. I think we need a suite of policies like what I talked about in the in California's scoping plan. Cap and trade has been used very effectively, as the gentleman noted, to reduce emissions of sulfur dioxide, which is the chemical that causes acid rain. And the use of a cap and trade program really, as opposed to technology mandates, resulted in the emissions reductions for sulfur dioxide being achieved at far less cost than had been anticipated. I think that we could have a global or even a U.S. cap and trade system for carbon. I think we would have to start with the sectors and the fuels where we can most effectively measure and create a credible currency that has value. Over time, we could work out to more difficult sectors like ag and forestry. But I think starting with fuels and driving it upstream and applying it to fuels is something that we can and should do and can do effectively.
California has a goal of 20% renewable energy by 2010. Mm-hmm. How close are we to that, and what are the problems involved and the problems going forward to meet the 33% goal?
Right. So on the books, so the answer is it is 2010 now, and it's almost the end of 2010. And if you look at the utilities that the PUC regulates, which are the only ones that actually that law applies to, it doesn't apply to the publicly owned utilities like DWP. I think that they're collectively at about maybe 16%, so they're not there now. But the way the rules are written, they actually don't have to get there till 2013 to get there. But as I was saying before, they owe us for what they didn't deliver this year. So they have to do more in 2013 to pay us back by borrowing against the future. So I think the prognosis is good to get there by 2013 with interest, so to speak. But I think that, and I met with a student earlier this afternoon who asked me if I thought that the 20% RPS program had been successful, and did it portend, did the experience with that portend that we would succeed with the 33% program. And I think And I kind of gave him a qualified yes on the success, because I think what we really learned with the 20% program is how hard it was going to be to get there. We learned, we had to do, there are unique challenges to siting and financing transmission for renewable energy. When you build a transmission line out to a giant mine mouth coal plant, or a plant like the Mojave plant, which I think is 800 megawatts, the line is basically financed with the plant. If you build a transmission line up to a place like the Tehachapi region, where there are going to be, maybe a few dozen different wind farms developed and some solar, thrown in as well, you can't expect any one of those developers to take responsibility for the line. And so we had to come up with new cost recovery mechanisms to make it possible to get the transmission line built. Some of these permitting challenges that I talked about before also arose. And so there's been a lot of learning by doing to get to the 20% that I think has slowed us down on the 20%, but put us in a much better position to get to the 33%. I think the big challenge for 33% is going to be the integration question that I talked about. And at least we see that and know that and are working on it and have some time to work on it.
Proposition 23 proponents claim that that should pass to save jobs. What is your estimate that if it passed and AB 32 was suspended, would there be a net actual loss of jobs, and if so, how much?
I think that the impact of AB 32 on jobs, one way or the other, has been overhyped. I think, and I say that so I think that it's not AB 32 is not a job killer, in my opinion, as the Prop 23 proponents have cast it. I also don't think that AB 32 is a great engine of economic growth, as some of the more enthusiastic proponents of AB 32 characterize it. I say that based on experience that I had over the last year serving on a blue ribbon panel that the governor put together to look, kind of closely scrutinize the economic analysis that the Air Resources Board was doing as part of its rulemaking process to implement AB 32. And I was the least eminent of the economists on this panel. There were professors from Stanford and Cal and out of experts from out of state who really combed through the economic modeling that's been done both by the Air Resources Board and by others. And the main conclusion that this group came to was that one way or the other, the economic impact of AB 32 is just not that great. So what I will say is that I do think that, as an economist, again, I believe very strongly in the principle of creative destruction, that the economy is always destroying. A dynamic, growing, healthy economy is one where businesses and business models and industries are always being destroyed and being made obsolete and irrelevant as others are growing and developing and materializing. And I think that the kind of push into clean tech and next generation energy efficiency that AB 32 gives us as a state really contributes, gives us a push in that direction of creative destruction. And so to me, I see that as the most important economic force associated with AB 32.
I think we have time for two more questions.
So one of the most technologically interesting developments is the idea of vehicle to grid, where theoretically you could have a bunch of electric vehicles acting as batteries and doing energy storage to integrate a bunch of renewables. I know that it's very far off. Is it at all within the CPUC's idea of what our smart grid is going to look like in the future, or is it just a complete pipe dream?
It's something that if it's a pipe dream, it's a pipe dream that we're all smoking the same stuff. Because it's very much something that we talk about. And at this point, I think we look at the policies as, enabling. How do we create policies around the smart grid and around the rollout of electric vehicles that will facilitate that vehicle to grid kind of exchange when the battery technology is there and the business model is there. I mean, my understanding now is that, like automakers, they don't want to go anywhere near this because they think that, well, maybe then the battery will go on the fritz and, the customer will blame them, and that just, it's not safe. So let's not do that. But, I mean, in the future, that may be a different story, or vehicles that, no longer really are trustworthy enough to be in a car. Or did I say that? Batteries that are no longer reliable to be in a car, may still be good for distributed storage. And so you might have a kind of a different model of it. But, yeah, there's a lot of excitement around the idea of vehicle to grid. I talked about automated demand response before, and the idea of like little changes aggregated across lots of buildings. And you could envision something, very similar if you've got, like thousands and thousands of cars plugged in all over the state during the peak that are charging, and they just sort of, the rate of charge goes up and down as a way to regulate the grid.
Okay, last question back there.
I was just wondering what you think the life of the solar equipment is going to be, and how will we dispose of it?
Well, the hardest question for last. I'm an economist. I'm not an engineer. So, my main guess is on the life of the solar equipment is that it will be economically obsolete before it is, technically, before it doesn't work anymore. Which only exacerbates the disposal problem, because it means, it's just like cell phones where, you have to get rid of them so fast. So I think that part of having a robust green energy ecosystem is to really bring that sort of cradle to cradle perspective to it, that we really have to find build into the industry the way to responsibly dispose of or hopefully recycle components of solar energy. But that's not where the focus is right now. It's definitely not where it is. But we'll get to where we have to have that focus, I think, not too long from now. Okay.
Okay, I want to do three very brief things before we go out to dessert. One is to give you a gift and thank you for visiting Harvey Mudd today.
Well, thank you so much.